This is your foundation. How to successfully grow your wedding business. Weddings Made Simple.
So firstly, let's talk about dynamic range. Now, a basic definition of dynamic range is the measurement between the maximum and the minimum light values in an image. In other words, how much detail can you see in the dark portions of your image and the light portions of your image at the same time? So think about your eyes having a dynamic range kind of like this, where this is your black and this is your white. Now imagine you're standing in a dark room on a sunny day with one window open. And if you look out at the scene, if you concentrate hard, you can see the detail in the shadows. Maybe there's a picture on the wall. You can see the curtains really well. And at the same time, you're still able to pick out the detail in the clouds, in the brightest portions of your image. This is because human vision has incredible dynamic range. Now compare that with a camera, which has a much narrower dynamic range. And you kind of have to pick between the two. If you want to expose for the shadows, if you want to be able to see all the detail inside the room, the window is going to be completely washed out. We call this clipped. If you want to expose for the highlights, you'll be able to see the sky, the clouds. However, inside the room is going to be black. We call this crushed.
So how does it help to have a camera with higher dynamic range in a wedding scenario? At weddings, you can't control a lot of circumstances. So having a camera with a lot of dynamic range allows you to shoot in a lot of circumstances that you may have to have other lighting put into, other softboxes that you're not going to have at weddings. You can get by with the dynamic range.
Yeah, so why don't we take a look at a couple examples of this.
Sounds great.
So this shot here was filmed with the Sony a6000, which came out in 2014 and has an APS-C sensor. So if you take a look at the waveform here, you'll see that the sidewalk here is this area and the scope's right about here. It's sitting around 1023, which is pretty near to clipping. In fact, it is clipping in some of these regions. Now, if you look at the shadow portion here, you'll see that it's sitting around 128 to about 384. Now, let's compare this shot to the same shot except with a Sony a7 III, which has a full frame sensor and was released in 2018. So look at the difference there. On the waveform, you'll see the highlights are completely intact. They're sitting around 896. And we'll even see that the shadow portion is raised as well. And so this camera has a much better dynamic range. We can see more in the shadows and in the highlights at the same time. Here's another example. Sony a6000. And make sure to note where the highlights are in the sky and the shadows are in the tree, versus the Sony a7 III. Look at all that data that we've preserved. Dynamic range is measured in stops. Go online and make sure you know your camera's dynamic range.
It's also important to note that there is the dynamic range that your camera will have listed, and then there is a more true dynamic range. If you go online, you can find a lot of videos that show you how to find your camera's true dynamic range.
Yeah, and dynamic range is often the dollar difference in the cameras these days, because resolution and frame rate is kind of a moot point at this point right now, because almost every camera can film 4K, 5K, 6K, even 8K at 60, 120 frames a second.
It's true. A lot of the systems nowadays are coming with incredible abilities to film in high resolutions, but when you really get down to the brass tacks of it, when you really get into grading, when you want to produce an image appropriately, you're going to want to look more at dynamic range.
This matters for digital color grading so that we can accurately assess how far we can push and pull our image to be able to preserve the most detail and the most quality possible.